All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Rob Doggett. I'm with State University of New York at Geneseo and the International Yeats Society. And I'm here today to talk with Ragini, Mohite, about Tagore. And this is a little bit unusual. Normally, I talk about individual poems with people, but we're doing a larger topic, and that's Yeats's relationship with Tagore. And you are the perfect person to speak with about that. So it's nice to see you. How are you doing?
I'm all right, thanks. I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. And I said you're the perfect person because you have a book coming out on this called Modern Writers, Transnational Literature, Rabindranath Tagore and W.B. Yeats. And that's coming out soon with Clemson University Press, right?
Yes, that's right.
And you're an assistant professor of academic writing at Flame University in India.
I am.
So this will be fun. And so in order to kind of keep the focus a little bit more narrow, we're gonna address or concentrate on Yeats's introduction to Gitanjali. And I'm pronouncing that slightly wrong, right? So correct me on that one. Or is it?
No, it's fairly accurate, yeah.
Okay, I got it right. In the English version, it's Song Offerings, Tagore's collection of poetry that came out with Macmillan in 1913. So we'll kind of go through the introduction a little bit and focus on individual passages. Before that, though, I thought you've got the book coming out, so if you could just talk a little bit in general about Yeats's relationship with Tagore and some of the things you cover in your book.
Right, I'd love to. So my book is basically a transnational reading of the works of these two authors. And what I'm trying to do is recognize the way their socio-political contexts were working alongside and in many ways impacting the aesthetics of their writing. And it was important for me, particularly given our topic today, to look beyond the public image that was crafted for Tagore, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's very conscious of both of these writers as global public figures. They were doing these international lecture tours and drawing their influences from so many different sort of cultural locations, China, Japan, the Indian subcontinent, and all of these other places. And I think that speaks to their modernist aesthetic, but I think their dynamic was also one branch of a larger Indo-Irish axis that had these enduring social and political sympathies. And this is at a time where nationalism is becoming a force to reckon with. And I think it's important to recognize that element of things within their dynamic and within their works as well. Thinking specifically of Yeats, I'm also very interested in the way his interactions with these particular members of the South Asian community are influencing his writings and his thematic interests at key points in his career. So it's first Mohini Chatterjee, and then we have Tagore, and then we have Shri Purohit Swami. And I think these figures do have some bearing on the way Yeats continues to think about these ideas of legacy and patronage and inheritance and spirituality.
And those were the elements that struck me really in reading that introduction, those elements of spirituality and a sort of inheritance. And I know we'll get a chance to talk more about that in a minute. I had a chance to read part of your book, at least. I read the introduction the other night, and I'm reading other parts of it. I love it, by the way. There's a quotation in there from the start that I was hoping you could comment on a little bit, where you say, "I do not anachronistically claim that Yeats and Tagore were writing transnationally, but instead that their works are concerned with a manner of nation making, not necessarily in terms of the nation state, but as a site for cultural affinities and social interactions." I was really struck by that, and maybe thinking about writing transnationally as not specifically or narrowly being about nation making in terms of the state, but organized nations organized around these affinities, these kinds of inheritances, I suppose, these kind of social interactions. So I wonder if you could, and that seemed a really foundational point in your book, and I'm wondering if you'd talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a key part of the way they're sort of writing about the nation, right? And particularly their places within that sort of dynamic, because we all know about Yeats's anxieties about the Anglo-Irish place in post-colonial Ireland. Tagore also sat quite uncomfortably within the ongoing discourses on nationalism and so on. So that idea of the nation as a space that is being actively constructed at any given point, I think is really key to their works. And I think it's key for us as critics to then recognize that, right? None of us is claiming that either Yeats or Tagore were the majoritarian voice
Right.
in their respective countries.
I think
But
that
I think
in your book too, you emphasize this idea of the like shared sense of dislocation for both of them, right? Like existing in these kind of interstitial spaces, and so always having then to imagine this kind of different understanding of the nation, quite different from a lot of the more traditional conceptions of nationalism that we get in both of their homelands.
yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why these acts of, writing and translating and mediating become all that much more important to them, because it's that question of how do you present yourself, right?
Mm-hmm.
Within that sort of dialogue, not just between these global cultures, that sort of cultural exchange and this nation as a site for that kind of exchange, but then also within varying traditions within that same cultural landscape.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And for me, the way I see it, reading the ways that Yeats and Tagore try to achieve this, or at least attempt it in their works, is for contemporary readers like us a way of reading transnationally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense, and that's I think that's really one of the most important central ideas in your book. That it's not just about Tagore and Yeats, but it's a whole sort of model for thinking about how to read modernism transnationally.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's look at the Yeats's introduction. I'm going to share the screen so people can see it. If I can find it, here it is. There we go. And we've got different parts highlighted and color coded, and we'll see how we'll see how that goes. So we're going to talk about I wanted to talk about the sort of the frame that Yeats sets up. It's kind of typically Yeatsian introduction to the introduction, and he sort of knows this. He had this distinguished Bengali doctor of medicine who we met a few days ago, and the doctor tells him about how much he loves Tagore, and how to read one line of his is to forget all the troubles of the world. And then Yeats sort of talks about, well, I need to speak with someone like this doctor in order to really get a sense of, what Tagore is all about. And the doctor says, with deep emotion, words can never express what I owed at 17 to his love poetry. After that, his art grew deeper. It became religious and philosophical. All the inspiration of mankind are in his hymns. He is the first among our saints who has not refused to live, but has spoken out of life itself. And that is why we give him our love. So I want to ask what you thought of this sort of framing device. What's going on here? Why does Yeats need this? And the kind of characterization we get from this doctor about Tagore, I think, is really interesting.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it's interesting that that Yeats does frame it that way, right? He needs this Bengali doctor of medicine, a modern man who shares, Tagore's background, clearly having read him in the original Bengali, right? To contextualize him. And what he's getting there is a poet who is already revered in Bengal, right? Sort of the language is framing him as that. Like you said, his art grew deeper, became religious, philosophical. There's a mention of, Tagore's hymns. There's a reference to him as a saint and so on. But I think there's also, in a sense, that sense of the modern celebrity around him.
Mm-hmm.
So the doctor calls it the epoch of Rabindranath, right? There's this man who comes from a famous family. He's already famous at 19. He's writing across genres. This is a man whose great sorrows are well known, right? He was part of the religious reform Brahmo Samaj movement, who reads divine service in that Brahmo church, right? It's framed in Christian terms, that church.
Right,
So
right here.
there's,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, the church in yeah,
that's the one,
yeah.
right? So there is that sort of sense of celebrity alongside that spirituality. But I think Yeats is privileging the first element, right? He's tracing through that idea of Tagore as this figure who is simultaneously exotic and strange, but somehow still familiar, right?
Mm.
Meditative and revered with this long creative inheritance.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it speaks to how Yeats is imagining that idea of the poet with a capital P, right? Himself included.
Mm-hmm.
So he's partaking in that image building exercise almost. But I
Yes.
think the frame, yeah,
Oh,
sorry.
no, go ahead. Go ahead.
And I think that framing is also really interesting because he's so conscious of the cultural role of the reader, right? So it's the Bengali man reading Tagore in the Bengali, but it's also Yeats as the reader. He is, in a sense, the first public reader of an English Tagore, right? And he's using that sort of dual framing to present what is essentially a mediated version of this man, right? Who is palatable and appealing to Western audience.
That's what strikes me in it is how crafted this is, and it's not surprising with Yeats. I mean, Yeats does this all the time.
Yeah.
But he's clearly I mean, Tagore was really he gushes about Tagore in a way that's pretty exceptional, and just
Yeah.
clearly like, crafting this sort of idea of this poet that I think is a reflection of precisely the kinds of interests, as you're saying, that Yeats himself had. Um,
Yeah.
and there's all of these kinds of blendings, right, going on of this sort of I think the modern doctor with this kind of
Yeah.
with this kind of deeper, long-standing heritage coming out of the East, this kind of spiritualism blending with modernity,
Mhm.
and it's really early on here, like conditioning readers in a particular, conditioning his audience to embrace Tagore in a particular way. I think, right?
Mhm. But but it's also the 1912, 1913 sort of time period, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sure, this figure of Tagore is sort of, in a sense, spiritual and philosophical, but it's also a depoliticized figure,
Mm.
right? By this point, Tagore already has a history of political dialogue, right? But it's not part of this framing for an audience that is going to read a translation of a text that was first published by the India Society and then more widely by Macmillan,
Mm-hmm.
right? He's very much got that sense of the writer as part of the cultural marketplace.
Mm-hmm.
And even what you said about the reader, right? You're right in that it's the community of readers that's being generated, right? That have a shared approach to a text.
Mm. Yeah, that's really interesting to me, right? I mean, that idea, yeah, creating this community that has this particular kind of sensibility and ability to
Mhm.
read this kind of text. I was interested to so in the second half of this first part, Yeats talks a lot about heritage. He then told me of Mr. Tagore's family and how for generations great men have come out of its cradle.
Mm.
And he says, Yeats says, at least you know how to keep a family illustrious. It's talking a lot about Tagore's sort of aristocratic background. I think that's up further, right? Was that at the start?
Mhm.
Um,
Still in the first section.
it's still in the first section. Is it in the next page? Oh, it's in the next page, right? Yeah, there it is. Yeah, there it is. He then told me Mr. Tagore's
Yeah.
family and everything. So just wondering about these kind of, and this is not surprising during this period. I mean, Yeats is, really interested in aristocratic heritage. And so what's going on here with Tagore's, he's playing up Tagore's aristocratic bona fides. And if you could make the distinction now, Chatterjee writes of a different sort of a different background than Tagore, right? And Tagore's coming out of a sort of landowning class, is that
Mhm.
right? And so
Yes,
maybe you could just
absolutely.
explain what's going on in the Indian context here, and then maybe why Yeats is so interested in playing this up.
Mhm. I mean, it's just in terms of Yeats's own context, right? By the time this is happening, he's already met Mohini Chatterjee. He's already engaged with the theosophical aspects. If he wanted to go deep into the spiritual elements of things, he could have,
Mm-hmm.
right? But you're right in that evocation of his family there is very interesting because, again, in Tagore's own background, his grandfather had made his fortunes trading with the East India Company, and the Tagores were landowners, and their holdings would increase over time. And one of his brothers was already part of the Indian civil service. But those are not the people who get included in this framing, right? It's his father, the Maharishi, literally translates to great sage,
Mm-hmm.
right? He's mentioned his brothers and his nephews, the artists and the philosophers. Those are the kind of, people who get invoked in Tagore's legacy here.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that sort of Yeats already had this enduring interest, right, with aristocracy. I mean, just the year before, it was 1911, right, where he was revising the Countess Kathleen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So there is that sense of aristocracy and its sort of social responsibilities and the big house as a structure in and of itself.
Yeah, I mean,
So
we're in the period where he's right, upon a house shaken by the land agitation sort of things, right? I mean, this is,
yeah,
this is definitely a concern of Yates. It's interesting, right? Like with the elements he's picking out of Tagore's family in the same way he sort of depoliticizes or detaches Tagore from politics. He sort of detaches his family from the kind of material material
yeah,
aspect of things, and the association with the East India Company is pretty fascinating, and it's definitely a particular kind of aristocratic heritage that that really aligns with Yeats's ideas
yeah.
about what the aristocracy represents. But it's also like but it's also like a transnational one. So a kind of idea of an
Mhm.
aristocracy that's not limited to one place. But I guess a sort of fantasy of a more global idea of this kind of aristocracy. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I think global idea of aristocracy is actually really apt, right? Because this is also a time where he is starting to deal with his sort of personal relationship to that idea of legacy as well. In 1914, he's going to publish Responsibilities, right? So he's going to talk about a romantic Ireland that's dead and gone. He's going to bring up poems like Bodine, but he's also going to ask pardon of the old fathers for
Mm-hmm.
at this stage not having anything but a book,
Yeah, yeah.
right? So I think with Tagore, and I think what Tagore presents to him as much as anything else is an opportunity. So I think in him, he's finding that representation or sort of at like an end point of a tradition that has, this long-standing aristocratic background, right? It's endured in his mind over generations. It's still, and that language of sort of cultural conservation is still there, right? It says, I think it's somewhere there. In the East, you know how to keep a family illustrious,
Yeah, yeah. And then, right, he goes to
right?
the other day, the curator of a museum. I mean,
Mm.
right there, like keeping the heritage, right? Curation,
Yeah.
this kind of idea of an unbroken continuity.
Hmm.
This gets at another thing that I was interested in from the first part, and we'll wrap up the first part of the
Just,
introduction. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
yeah. Just to point out, but that idea of the unbroken continuity, right? So that sense of aristocracy, it's coming not just based on third-party information about Tagore, but it's also it's an Orientalist conception of that East, right? The capital E East, which includes all of these different places that he's referring to.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
that notion of it for sure. Um, what the next? I was interested in the end of this first part. Yates has a sort of dig at popular taste. He says, "4/5 of our energy is spent in the quarrel with bad taste, whether in our own minds or in the minds of others." He's still continuing with the doctor here. So what's going on with? I think this idea of setting things up in a way probably tied in with um, Yeats imagining the readers of Tagore and sort of conditioning them in advance to think that it is tasteful to appreciate Tagore, that one would have bad taste if they somehow didn't value Tagore's writings. But I don't know. What do you think of this part?
I mean, I'm always a little amused by this part because he's clearly coming from a somewhat bitter place, right? Because this immediately sort of speaks back for me to, you know, the reception that the Countess Kathleen, or the playboy of the Western world, had received, and those had clearly impacted Yeats, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it almost feels cautionary here. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I agree, and it's sort of a fear of how particular authors might be that Yeats champions might be received by the masses, and again, establishing like in advance, like, well, if anyone's going to reject Tagore, it's because those people have bad taste.
Yeah.
Of course, they didn't reject Tagore. He was incredibly popular with these the version. And Yeats, with the Macmillan version that Yeats was really supporting, is the one that I guess one of the reasons I think that I'm sure that Tagore was awarded the Nobel Prize.
It was.
So we go into the next section here. I thought this, you and I were chatting before this, our discussion about this first part. I've carried the manuscript of these translations about with days reading at railway trains or on top of omnibuses and in restaurants. And I've often had to close it lest some stranger would see how much it moved me. And then he gives this whole really sort of flowery description of the lyrics before we've gotten anything from, we don't have any quotations from the poetry.
Yeah.
It's a sort of description. Interesting word there too, in that untranslatable delicacies of color. So I don't know if you want to read this passage, but you can if you want, and then maybe comment on it. And I'm interested in the way it's set up with the initial sort of gesture towards like the world of like modernity and motion and speed and fluidity, and then this like idea of some kind of permanence that's connected with the East.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So should I read that first then?
Sure. What the heck?
Okay. These lyrics, which are in the original, my Indians tell me, full of subtlety of rhythm, of untranslatable delicacies of color, of metrical invention, display in their thought a world I have dreamed of all my life long. The work of a supreme culture, they yet appear as much the growth of the common soil as the grass and the rushes. A tradition where poetry and religion are the same thing, has passed through centuries, gathering from learned and unlearned metaphor and emotion, and carried back again to the multitude the thought of the scholar and the noble. If the civilization of Bengal remains unbroken, if that common mind which, as one divines, run through all, is not, as with us, broken into a dozen minds that know nothing of each other, something even of what is most subtle in these verses will have come in a few generations to the beggar on the roads.
A lot of ideas that I know you touch on in your book here. My Indians tell me is an interesting
Oh dear.
But that idea of a continuity, things that are unbroken. Yeah, what do you think of this section in this description of Tagore?
I mean, there's two things I find really interesting in the bit I read out there. My Indians, right? Like, it's not just a sort of, it's almost an acquisitionist way for Yeats to collect this information about what the lyrics are in their original Bengali. But if you know the part that you read out just before that, there is that sense of community, right? Because his Indians, they are not part of that audience that he is crafting. Right? They get his emotions. He does not have to close the book just in case they see how much he's moved by them. Right? They are instead the part of his effort of mediation of that image and the marketing. So they're very much on his side. They're his Indians. It's not a phrase we would see in a contemporary text, I think. But the other bit is that little flowery piece of language that you mentioned, right? Full of subtlety of rhythm, untranslatable delicacies of color and of metrical invention. And I think that sits very interestingly alongside his sort of spiritualist sense of Tagore.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we look at those individually, they're modernist,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
The focus on the rhythm, the untranslatability, metrical invention, these are modernist qualities. And there is no denying that Tagore's Bengali lyrics were linguistically innovative, they were radical. He was aware of globally modernist trends,
Mm-hmm.
right? But I think what Yeats is doing, he's not situating him in that way.
Mm-hmm.
He's pushing him back into history, right? So he's making references to the Renaissance. Tagore is Chaucer's forerunner. So in that sense, that transcultural journey is almost, it's not just from Bengal to England. It's also from a writer publishing his works in print back to a more oral culture.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? So the bardic traditions of Ireland must have been on Yeats's mind.
Mm-hmm.
But also Tagore's own, I mean, the Bengali doctor of medicine surely told him that Tagore's songs are often set to music.
Mm-hmm.
It's called Rabindra Sangeet, right? And there is that sort of coming and going, because these lyrical texts in the Bengali become prose poems here. Right? So, yeah.
To follow up on that idea, there was the line a little bit further down where he says, since the Renaissance, the writing of European saints, however familiar their metaphor in the general thought, has ceased to hold our attention. And that I thought you mentioned earlier that idea of Tagore, the spiritualism, unbroken continuity, the saint, the oral tradition that's linked with church that Yeats mentions, or the Bengali doctor mentions as the churches, and this idea like that something maybe is lost in the world of England and the West and modernity, a discontinuity or disconnection from these ancients that Tagore exhibits in an Eastern context. Is that right? So that idea of this kind of Tagore is this like bridge between present and past.
Oh, yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? That idea of the bridge, because, yeah, present and past, also East and West, right? It's that very Asianist ideal of two halves coming together.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, even here, if you sort of look at the screen there, it's mentions of Saint Bernard in the Book of Revelations, alternated with Tagore's poetry. And then you get mentions of Thomas à Kempis and John of the Cross, St. Francis and William Blake. But all of the quotes from Tagore's poetry, and I was looking at this a little bit earlier, and these are all quotes of poems that speak to, fleeting moments and journeys being undertaken, sort of renunciation of worldly concerns, right? And it almost seems aspirational, as sort of rising above sort of commercial concerns that were of the modern
Mm-hmm.
period.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think
so like enacting what that opening story about being you're on the bus and you have to cover up your book because people might see that you're really moved by the poetry you're reading.
I think he likes that idea of this, sort of man who represents a pre-industrial pastoral spirituality, or it's sort of a source of comfort to him.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
When we read those, the lines of the Bengali doctor initially, the words can never express what his poetry meant to me at 17.
Mm-hmm.
I'm always thinking of the poem that Yeats would write in sort of a few years later, 1928, I think, Mohini Chatterjee,
Mm-hmm.
where he talks about that Brahmin figure,
mm-hmm.
Preaching renunciation so that he could set to rest a boy's turbulent days.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And these are two very different men with two very different spiritualities.
Mm-hmm.
But what he's drawing from them is that sense of comfort.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm also thinking about just the framing of I think setting it and having the different color there, just setting Tagore, and we see the way in which Yeats is so conditioning readers to embrace this particular kind of vision of Tagore, right?
Yeah.
And he goes on to do that in part 3, and we should get to the last part here. And so he talks about this. What did he say? He talks about this sort of an innocence, a simplicity that one does not find elsewhere. I mean, there's so much characterization of Tagore. I'm wondering, what you think of all this, kind of the way that Tagore is getting framed in this last section. I mean, it seems innocent, simple, childlike, but it's also the product. And I'm looking for that one part. At times, I wonder if he has it from the literature of Bengal, or from religion. And at other times, remembering the birds alighting on his brother's hands, I find pleasure in thinking it's hereditary.
Again.
Mystery that was growing through the centuries, like the courtesies. I mean, that's so interesting, right? Well, initially he's like, okay, so we got this childlike self, this innocence, this simplicity, but then it's been forged from something larger. And he's like, well, maybe it's the literary tradition, but maybe it's the religious tradition, well, sort of, but really it's out of this kind of hereditary tradition.
Yeah.
So what's going on there?
It's funny, isn't it? Knowing that this is Yeats, it's all of those things. It's never just one of those things. It's just, yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because...
God, I was just going to say that I think this is Yeats in some ways writing about what his own poetry aspires to be, right?
Yeah. But I mean, also the child, right? I mean, it's a potent if patronizing image. But I mean, again, there's different things, different days. In some ways, I think this is sort of two things happening here to me, right? So this is a Tagore that he has imagined for his audience, right? So he's spiritual and simple and detached and childlike.
Yeah, all the infantilizing, all the Orientalist kind of
Yes.
one there.
But therefore also vulnerable to the market in which he's entering.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? So, and it's a very strange way of positioning a man who was no stranger to the business of literature or to the publishing markets in India. He was prolific. So it almost goes against type.
Well, that's what I mean in reading your book. That comes out. So it's so interesting thinking about that, because I mean I'm generally used to seeing Tagore through the framing of Yeats, and then seeing a different vision of Tagore that's just much more savvy and more complex than what we're getting here.
And that's something we also see in the Post Office, which gets published by Kohler Press in 1914, although it's somebody else's translation. And there are two texts that have interesting interaction in that period. But I mean, even going back to this text, right? The second thing that's really interesting for me there is that if you sort of scroll down to that last little quotation there in red, right? It goes back to that, it's almost a utopian sense of that writer as above these dull worldly concerns of commerce and politics, right? He's ending here with Tagore's words, but from a poem that is included in a different collection published in 1913, right? And it's not mercantile, that idea of creation here. It's children creating for the sake of creation. It's play, it's joyous, right? And right, so children have their play on the seashore of worlds. And he knows, right? So this is the first publication of Tagore's works in English to come out. He very much knows that it's the text that's going to make his image. We know its popularity. right? So I think Yeats is working with the knowledge. He knows that this is the text that's at that sort of, it's crossing those aquatic, cultural, linguistic passages. It's on the cusp. And I think choosing to end it there by sort of leading us through those shallow waters with snippets, I think is really interesting.
That's great. So Ragini, if you maybe, and just where'd the relationship go real quick? After, I know.
Okay.
I mean, this was a sort of high point of collaboration, right? And then you got a kind of bit of a falling away.
Yeah. So they worked sort of collaboratively for this collection, and I think Tagore was always a little sort of, he writes in his correspondence about his sort of difficulties with literal translation and so on and so forth. But with Yeats, he said somewhere that we got 3 good collections out of him, presumably Gitanjali, The Crescent Moon, and The Gardener, and he calls the later works sentimental rubbish.
Yeah.
Right? He'll write about this to Macmillan, he'll write about it to William Rothenstein, but he did continue to admire Tagore's prose works. So The Home in the World, The Post Office, Sadhana, Reminiscences. And I think Tagore, for his part, admired Yeats for all the same reasons that Yeats admired Tagore. Right? So he's writing that in an essay titled Poet Yeats, he's writing of Yeats as, voicing the heart of Ireland, for vocalizing that old and constant idea that must be achieved through contemplation, right? He's certainly sees him as a voice of Ireland in the world literature sense in that essay. Doesn't quote quite as much from Yeats, but yeah, they would resume a sort of casual correspondence, intermittent as it was years later and things, but it wouldn't ever be as sort of intimately collaborative as this period was. But again, there's no denying that what they were doing in this period worked, right? Because once World War I happened and the sort of context of the way this book was received changed, later modernists would go to sort of talk about their dissatisfaction with Tagore. But there was a point at which, so it was published by Macmillan in 1913. He received the Nobel on 13th November. And within those few months, Gitanjali was reprinted 10 times, right? So it had admirers like Pound and Wilfred Owen. In 1915, Marianne Moore is writing a poem that recognizes not just the value of Tagore's words, but particularly Yeats's introduction. So I think in that sort of intense collaborative period, I think they achieved a hell of a lot.
Yeah, I remember you noting that in your book, and I was like, "Wow, I hadn't Marianne Moore. I hadn't known that at all." And so, yeah, this sort of in this whole milieu, and Yeats, is always, I think, really, really savvy with marketing, and his instincts were right, and he. I think, I mean, it's clearly genuine admiration, but also, I think, admiration of a particular sort of Tagore that conformed with a lot of Yeats's own assumptions and vision about himself and his own ideas of what the poet is, but also I think does a good job with that introduction in setting up, conditioning the audience of readers for this.
Absolutely.
Well, that was a lot of fun. I enjoyed talking with you. So thanks again, and I know your book's coming out pretty soon, so everybody's get to see that. So nice talking with you, Ragini.
All right, thank you so much.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.